With the continuing human rights violations that plague Tibet and the threat of cultural destruction looming, one organization has fought hard to preserve its unique religious and cultural heritage. The Tibet House was founded in 1987 in part by the actor Richard Gere. This Monday night, Tibet House marks its 10th anniversary with a benefit concert at Carnegie Hall. Joining me now, Robert Thurman, president of the Tibet House and professor of Buddhist studies at Columbia, and Natalie Merchant, the singer-songwriter who will be among those performing on Monday night. I am pleased to have both of them. First, what is Tibet House and who formed it, and was Richard Gere, in fact, sort of part of the forming of this?
Absolutely. Well, it's nice to be here, Charlie. Yes, His Holiness the Dalai Lama asked a bunch of us in the early 80s to, to take an interest in the cultural side of Tibet.
Right.
Some people were helping him, trying to save Tibet politically in the little ways that they can. But he said he would like to see, for the long run, whatever happens, that the exile community and the people in Tibet have a chance to have some restoration and preservation of their culture. And we had been working on it for a while when Richard came along. And once Richard joined up in the 86 and 7, we really got formed. We got our certificates, etc. He brought us out to the public. And he was the indispensable, of the three of us who co-founded it, he was the indispensable key, yes. Actually. As he used to jokingly say, we were in gear when we had Richard Gere.
Yeah. He came here one night and we spent most of the evening not talking about movies as I did with David Lynch, but talking really about his relationship to Tibet.
But he's been wonderful, and he's sustained, it hasn't been faddish for him. It hasn't been just now this and now that. He's had a sustained supporting role for Tibet, and everyone is very
goes over and spends that time there. But I want to talk about you rather than Richard Gere tonight. How did you get involved, and where comes your sense of mission here?
Well, this will be my 4th year doing the Tibet House benefit at Carnegie Hall, and it all started with a phone call from Philip Glass, who's the organizer of the event, and very active in Tibet House as well. And at the time, I really became involved because of my interest in global human rights, and I knew a bit about Tibet. But I've been extremely fortunate through this event to meet so many people, most importantly, Mr. Thurman, who've been great educators about not only the political situation in Tibet, but the cultural, history.
Have you been to Tibet? Have you met the Dalai Lama? Or?
I was, through an invitation of Professor Thurman's, I was able to see a dialogue between the Dalai Lama and a group of Western scientists for 2 days at Columbia. That was, what, 2 years ago?
Yeah, 3 years ago.
3 years ago, which was fascinating. And that's the closest I've come to meeting the Dalai Lama.
Look, there are a lot of problems in the world, as you know.
Yes.
Why should we care about Tibet?
Well, Charlie, there's a lot of reasons, but the simplest one, I think, is that Tibet is the major country that has been annexed and invaded, and and its independence violated by China since World War II. As you know, sort of with the founding of the UN, the imperialism, the ability of big powers to go and take countries, sort of everyone decided to swear off doing that, right? And the Chinese, in fact, demanded Hong Kong back from the British under those principles of the post-World War II order, the order of inviolate boundaries. And Bush went in to save Kuwait from Iraq under that same idea that you just can't throw your weight around on the planet, that all these borders are inviolate. And in fact, China in 1949 and 50 invaded a sovereign country, and everyone turned the other way, because India wanted to be friends with China, because the British wanted business in Hong Kong, because we were engaging China in Korea and in Taiwan, and we didn't want to have to deal with the Himalayas, So in fact, it's this sort of festering sore of global hypocrisy that somehow Tibet had never existed, and somehow it is China's, the sort of Saddam Hussein-like claim that Mao made was accepted by everybody. And yet it's not the truth, and the fact is that Tibetans are a people who are under genocidal threat, and subconsciously and subliminally everyone knows it. And the grassroots, the people around the world have really come to know it very much, especially since the Dalai Lama got the Nobel Prize, It's become very widely known, and yet the governments do nothing about it. At the moment, I think the reason it's becoming so intense, the publicity about it, is that we are trying to now, we've healed, or we've at least overcome the major threat with Russia. South Africa has changed and is now going on a hopeful route, although a lot of problems.
There's a peace process in the Middle East.
Peace process in the Middle East is very tense, but something is going on. But the last big problem, of course, is the dictatorship of China, with the tremendous human rights repression, with the big Laogai, you know, the labor camps that they have, with the way they behave outside the rule of law, you know, in general. And we hope to lure them into the rule of law. Of course, our whole policy is based on that. But Tibet is the outstanding example, although I believe Hong Kong will be number 2 shortly, of the fact that they still are not behaving on the rule of law.
And you feel the worst for Hong Kong based on what you just said?
Absolutely. I can tell you now, Charlie, that at this day, although they haven't yet taken over Hong Kong, they have banned photographs of the Dalai Lama in Hong Kong. It is now, you can get in trouble for having a picture of the Dalai Lama in Hong Kong. So when they try
suggesting a kind of repression to come.
Totally. And they've announced that intention.
And so what do you think of the Clinton administration's policy?
Well, we are very disappointed in President Clinton. We are so disappointed, it's almost unspeakable. I know President Clinton. I had a personal conversation with him before, when he was governor in Chappaquiddick. He knew about the Tibetan situation. In '92, he said he would do something about the butchers of Beijing, and he would hold their feet to the fire on human rights. And he criticized Bush for being soft on them, you know, and coddling them with trade privileges. As soon as he got in, he canceled the linkage between human rights behavior and trade. And in 1994, he said, no longer will we even review their human rights performance in order to grant them most favored nation
We'll
status.
de-link it from...
We'll de-link. And certain people in the Senate followed him in that, Senator Feinstein and others, and they just said, forget it, we're not going to do this. And since they did that, the Chinese have taken out all the stops in Tibet. They have moved in hundreds of thousands of people. They're crushing all the Tibetans. Yeah. They've arrested everybody.
But of course you know that Henry Kissinger and a lot of other people who have looked at the situation there and say the way to go with China is quiet diplomacy, and you go in and you make your threats when the doors are closed, and you don't link it to trade, but you do it by...
appeasing tyranny.
Thank you,
in other words, there is, in your eye, if you don't link trade and business and economic relationships to human rights and to Tibet, then the Chinese will never change.
And when the people who are industrial leaders of the world look at China and they say 1 of every 3 people in the world is Chinese, and there aren't enough cars over there aren't enough televisions yet, there aren't enough radios, there's an open market, and they'll just like funneling goods, and we're not talking about just harmless goods like televisions and telephones, weapons.
Right.
The Chinese are sending weapons to other places like Pakistan and like
certainly to Iran,
Now,
Pakistan.
But is the argument before I go, we've discussed this and we'll discuss it on an upcoming program about China, which you know about. But here is my question: what is it? Tell me how you see the Dalai Lama.
The Dalai Lama?
Yes.
The Dalai Lama is, well, he's a great guy. I've known him since 1962, and he's a wonderful person. But as far as the world goes, he is someone who has a really wonderful message to the world that these kind of situations must be solved nonviolently. He is not an enemy of China's. They try to say he's their arch enemy, and they try to stop people from giving him visas. They almost had a fit when the Norwegians gave him the Nobel Peace Prize. But he's not their enemy. He doesn't want China to fall apart or anything. He wants simply them to behave honestly in Tibet and behave honestly with the rest of the world, and then he feels things will work out for them. You know, of course, they trashed his country completely, and yet he does not nurse a grudge or wish for vengeance against them. The Tibetans have never resorted to terrorism, and it is a very remarkable thing that a world leader like that would want international liberation in a case of severe repression and even genocidal repression. And yet he's not preaching terrorism or violence. This is an amazing example, and really our people should listen to him. And President Clinton is such a disappointment in that he won't see the Dalai Lama when he goes to Washington. The senators, Moynihan, Helms, Pell, have tried to get him to visit the Oval Office, and he won't receive him for fear of China. And yet, as we know, he's been having coffee with Chinese arms dealers and the general who commanded in Tiananmen Square. He is not representing our nation's values in this case.
You think China, you think the powers that be in China have undue influence on the president?
Oh, I think that this is now coming out in the press, and it's very, very disappointing.
And you think that's behind his policy point?
Well, what do you think, Charlie? I can't really say. I'm not a political scientist. I'm just a religion professor, but it doesn't look very good. It really doesn't look very good.
Are you attracted to the religious aspects of the Dalai Lama, or is it yours a question for you and your involvement, a question of Tibet and human rights and individual freedom?
Well, with my original exposure through Tibet House and the benefit, it was just my horror at the genocidal conditions in Tibet, but also my amazement at the power of forgiveness and the spirit of compassion that so many of the Tibetans that I've personally met have, and my respect for the Dalai Lama as a leader of his nation in exile with so little, you know, rancor toward the people who've oppressed his nation. And so just as a living philosophy, the bit of studying I've done of Buddhism is extremely attractive
and, and compelling. This Monday, February 17th, there's a benefit at Carnegie Hall. Robert Thurman will be there, and so will Natalie Merchant. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you on Monday night. See you then.